All right, this class is going to be about the essay topic on your list about the Articles of Confederation of the Constitution. And where we're at now is we just finished up with the Revolutionary War. So now that America is independent, they've got to figure out how to run the country. So they're going to come up with a plan of government. It's going to be called the Articles of Confederation. However, the Articles of Confederation isn't going to work, so it's going to be replaced by the Constitution. So what I want to get at in this class is what exactly the Articles of Confederation tried to do. What problems occurred during the 1780s that forced the country to abandon it? Right? And why did they replace it with the specific plan of the Constitution? And what you'll see in there is that what we're going to be looking at is a common theme. The theme is the power of government. The Articles of Confederation created a weak government. They did that on purpose. The Constitution is going to create a strong government, right? And when they do this for reasons. And so we're going to be going into that in your class today. And let's start off by starting out in 1781. Where we left off in 1781, the Revolutionary War is wrapping to a close. So the Second Continental Congress, the group that was the political leadership of the country, decided that they needed a formal plan of government. That is, what the Second Continental Congress was it was created very informally. In 1774, the legislatures of the 13 colonies sent representatives to meet in order to plan out a common plan to negotiate with the king. This was called the Continental Congress. All they decided to do was meet again the next year. So in 1775, they met as the Second Continental Congress. While they were meeting, shooting broke out at Lexington and Concord. So for the rest of the Revolutionary War, the Second Continental Congress was the de facto government of the United States. It had no formal authority to be a government. It was just the only thing that was around. So as the war is coming to a close, the Second Continental Congress wants to replace themselves with a formal plan. So they appointed a committee headed up by this guy here. His name is John Dickinson. And Dickinson drew up a plan. It was called the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation is actually innovative in the history of the world. This was the first time anybody came up with a written plan of government. That is, in throughout history, governments get their authority through a combination of force and tradition. Right? That is, you had a king in England. The king got to be king in 1066 when his family conquered England. If you disagreed with them, they pointed a gun and shot at you. Over the years, though, there developed traditions over what the king could do with that power. That is, what limits that he had, what rights people had, what rights that noblemen had, so on and so forth. These weren't put on paper anywhere. These were just the way that England had run over the years, and so they were considered to be the way England was run. However, under mercantilism, remember, those traditional rights are going away. That is, you're having power consolidating into nation states. Powerful people control the nation states, and they are taking away rights that traditionally people thought they had. That's one of the reasons why you had the American Revolution in the first place. So the leaders of the new United States decided we're going to put down on paper explicitly what the government can and can't do. That way, you won't have anybody taking away those types of rights again, like they said the government of England did. So the leadership of the United States had the Second Continental Congress draw up the Articles of Confederation. And if you go through the Articles of Confederation, it lists 10 separate paragraphs or articles that say what the powers of the government are. We'll see one common theme showing up in all of them, and that common theme is weakness. The Articles of Confederation was specifically designed to create a weak government. What do I mean by weak? Well, if you look by the articles, it lists four specific things the government of the United States is authorized to do. It said the government of the United States could declare war on its enemies. It said the government of the United States could make treaties with other nations. It said the government of the United States could deal with Indians. What could it do with the Indians? It could declare war on them or make treaties with them. And it said the government of the United States has the sole authority to deal with common lands. What that means is when the United States became independent, the treaty that ended the war gave the United States all this land over here in the West. Okay, that is, the United States stretched all the way from the Atlantic to the Mississippi River. The 13 colonies, though, the 13 states now, had conflicting claims on this land in the West. So the Congress of the United States under the Articles of Confederation was given the authority to sort through those claims, to decide who gets what. So those four powers are listed in the Articles. The end, which means that the government of the United States did not have a lot of things that it needed in order to really do anything. What couldn't it do? Well, for one thing, there's nothing in the Articles of Confederation that gives the United States government the authority to tax anybody. Right? If the government wanted money, it would have to go to the states and ask for money. And the states had the authority to say no. This, in and of itself, makes a government very weak. Because think of it in your own purposes. How many of you spent the weekend once with no money? What did you wind up doing in that weekend? Probably nothing. So if you don't have any money, you can't do anything. But the weaknesses of the government went deeper than that. Right? For one thing, the articles did not give the government of the United States the authority to keep a standing army. Remember, having a professional military was one of the grievances they had with the British government in the Declaration of Independence. So the government under the Articles could declare all the wars it wanted, it just couldn't fight any. If it wanted soldiers to actually fight any of those wars, it would have to ask the states to borrow their militias, and the states had the authority to say no. The government of the United States had no authority to regulate trade under the Articles of Confederation. That is, there are three types of commerce in America. There is interstate commerce. That's when commerce goes from one state to another. That is, say you own a business in Pennsylvania, you sell something in New York, that's interstate. There is intrastate commerce. Say you own a business in Pennsylvania, you sell to somebody in Pennsylvania, that's intrastate. And there's international commerce. You make something in Pennsylvania, you sell it in Mexico. Under the Articles, the US government had no authority to regulate any of that. So all of that was the authority of the state where you owned your business. Right? So you had things like New York would put tariffs, taxes on goods imported from New Jersey, things that are illegal today. You go more into the structure of the government on the Articles, you see more weakness. For one thing, under the Articles, the government had no executive branch. That is, there was no president, and there was no bureaucracy beneath the president. So there were no tax collectors, no bureaucrats, okay, no police, no prosecutors. All of those, if the government wanted anything, it would have to have the states for their bureaucracies to do that, and the states could say no. Sorry. Also, the government under the U.S. government under the Articles had no court system. Right? If it wanted to try a case under U.S. law, it would have to borrow a state court in order to hear it. Right? So if the government, say, wanted to prosecute somebody for violating a law passed by Congress, it would have to borrow a state court to hear the case. The state judge would have to learn U.S. law in order to hear it. And it would have to borrow a state prosecutor in order to argue its case for it. And it would probably have to get a state policeman to arrest you in the first place. So the government had no executive authority. It had no bureaucracy. It had no courts. The government under the Articles of the United States boiled down to one branch. That was the legislative branch, Congress. In Congress, each state got one vote. They could send as many congressmen as they wanted, but they would have to caucus together and come up with a vote. For example, New Jersey sent 3 congressmen. The 3 of them would get together and they would decide how New Jersey voted. If, in order to pass a law, Congress needed the approval of 9 of the 13 states. So you would need 9 out of 13 of the congressmen to vote for it. And the only laws they could pass were about the 4 things that I mentioned earlier. They could pass a law declaring war. They could pass a law ratifying a treaty. They could pass a law dealing with Indians, or they could pass a law dealing with land in the West. If they wanted to do anything else, they would have to amend the articles first. Amending the articles required the unanimous vote of all 13 states in Congress. Right? So over the 6 years of its existence, the Articles of Confederation was never amended, and it only passed one law of any real significance. That was something called the Northwest Ordinance. The Northwest Ordinance dealt with how the lands in the West were going to be distributed, specifically the lands north of the Ohio River and west of the Appalachian Mountains. That winds up creating 5 states today in the Midwest: Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Yeah, Wisconsin. Okay. So you put all that together, you get a government that's very weak. It can't really do anything. And the first thing I want to get into is why it was weak. That is, if you read about this in the textbook, if you covered this in high school, usually they will just stop it at that. The government was weak. They realized it was weak, so they got rid of it and created a new government under the Constitution. That implies they didn't want it weak in the first place. Right? And that isn't true. That is, the government was weak because the leadership and public of the United States in 1781 wanted it that way. They deliberately wanted a United States government that couldn't do anything. Right? Why would they want a United States government that couldn't do anything? Well, remember what they had been doing for the previous 7 years. They had been fighting a war against a powerful English government that they thought was trying to destroy them. They were deeply paranoid and suspicious of powerful governments. So if you fought a war to get rid of a powerful government, what would be the last thing you would want to do once you finally get rid of it? How about creating a new one to replace it? Right? So their history with England is one thing that's going to lead them towards deliberately creating a government that doesn't have much power. But also you have to look in terms of their interests. That is, you've got two types of people in America that are going to be important in shaping the future. One is the middle class. That is, if you're a middle class American, you are the vast majority of the American public. If you're a middle class American 1781, 82, 83, what that meant was you were a small farmer. You owned 50 to 200 acres, and you grew on that land what you needed to survive. And you really did not sell very much stuff and deal much with money. Okay? So if you were such a person, what did you need a government for in 1781? If you go around the suburbs today, you see a lot of people in the suburbs talking a lot of smack about how they don't need the government. That is not true. That is, if you go around, say, the Houston area today, you drive on roads built by the government. You're currently going to a college that's run by the government at some level. You went to a public school, in all probability, that was made by the government. However, if you lived in 1781, you really didn't get anything from a government. Governments did not have public schools. The governments didn't build roads. The governments barely kept law and order. That is, if you were a small farmer, you lived in the middle of nowhere. The sheriff was probably a 6-day ride away by horseback. So if you were going to get robbed, you would have to defend yourself. So if you're a middle class person in 1781, the only thing the government was to you was something that could tax you and start stupid wars. So if somebody came up to you and said, we're going to create a government that has no power to do anything, especially it doesn't have the power to tax, you were all on board with it. Because remember, from when we dealt with the origins of the American Revolution, middle class people in America were terrified of taxes. They thought taxes were a threat to their land. So middle class America, the vast majority of the population, was perfectly comfortable with the idea of having a U.S. government that had no power. The other major factor in America were going to be rich people. For rich people, things are a little bit more complicated. Because if you're rich, you do need something from a government. You need protection. Because if you're rich, you own a lot of property. You're a slave owner down here in the South, where you own slaves, you own land, you produce stuff to sell. Or you're a merchant, a shipper up here in New England. where you own a store, you own inventory, you have a warehouse, you have a boat, you have property, or you're a food producer over here in the middle. You take food, you sell it in the Caribbean. That you get money for that. And you have property, you have tenants that are growing your food, so on and so forth. All of that is stuff that doesn't exist if there's not a government to protect it. That is, property requires the protection of a government because without a government, there is no property. As all Without a government, all you get is force. If you don't have the firepower, somebody's just going to come up with you with a gun and take away everything you have. If you're in the South, you're very vulnerable to a slave revolt. If you're in New England, maybe you get robbed. Maybe your store gets looted, so on and so forth. So governments require the protection of a government. I mean, rich people require the protection of a government in order to maintain their property. But do they need a national government? Because let's look at it from their perspective. If, say, you're a slave owner in South Carolina, you control your local government. That is, on your county, you're probably the biggest figure in the county. You're the richest person in the county. You control who is going to be elected county judge. You control who is going to be elected any county official. You know that the county isn't going to cross you. And the county is going to be primarily responsible for maintaining law and order. After all, if you get robbed, you're not going to call Trump. You're going to call 911, the local police, the sheriff. If you're in New England, you probably got a town council. If you're the biggest merchant in town, that town council isn't going to cross you because they know if they give you a hard time, you can make sure that the town council gets replaced. And even if you can't do that, you could just pack up your inventory and move someplace else. Right? And once again, you're going to get the bulk of your property protected by local police. So if you are a wealthy person, local government is there to protect your property, and local government is something that you figure will be loyal to you. If local government has a problem that they can't handle, the next step on the chain is the states. If you're a tobacco farmer in Virginia, you get to pick who your state legislature is going to be. And if you go up to the legislature, probably the majority of the legislature is going to be other guys like you, right? That is, other tobacco farmers pick their representatives. So you could be fairly comfortable that the state legislature won't be doing anything that'll be harmful to your interests. It'll be loyal to you. And the state could call out the militia to maintain order if there's a big problem that the local police can't handle. If you're a merchant in Boston, the Massachusetts legislature is going to be full of merchants like you. So you can feel comfortable about their loyalty, and their militia could protect your property. So if that's the case, what do you need a national government for? Right? The national government is going to be redundant because, after all, your property is already protected at the state and local level. And you can never really be sure of the loyalty of the national government. Because let's take it from the perspective of, say, a tobacco farmer in Virginia. Who is going to be on that national government? And you'll have some representation on it, but what would happen if people from another part of the country dominated it? Say the New England merchants wound up being the majority in Congress. Then they could use the government to do whatever they wanted, and then they could send you the bill. Right? If you were a tobacco farmer in Virginia, that's what you thought your relationship with England was. The parliament was dominated by rich people in England who did what they wanted and just looked at you as a resource, as a sheep to be sheared, as somebody to be taxed, as one of the little people who could be squeezed. Right? So if the wrong people control the government, that same thing could happen to you again. If you're a merchant in Massachusetts, you're worried about the same thing. What happens if the slave owners control the government? Then they do what they want and send you the bill. Right? Also, you're worried about if there is a powerful national government, what would happen if that national government didn't think about any of the states? That is, you could look over in Europe and places like France and England. You saw the rise of powerful nation states that had centralized bureaucracies around them. We talked about in the class before. The people who filled those bureaucracies started to identify more with the nation, with their king, with their leader, than they did with the people in the provinces. They just looked at the people in the provinces as a resource, people to be taxed, right? So say you wind up with a powerful leader in America, right? Builds a personality cult around it. What happens if he decides, okay, you're just somebody, I'm going to take your money? If he's got a powerful military, if he's got a professional bureaucracy around it, who is loyal to him, but not to the people out in the provinces, even the rich people out in the provinces, right? Then that government is a threat to you. So when wealthy people in America saw the national government, they saw a body that could threaten their interests that really wouldn't serve much of a purpose for them. So if that's the case, the Articles of Confederation works pretty well. That is, you give the government under the Articles the handful of things that the states can't deal with. That is, how to deal with lands that they're disputing about, dealing with foreign nations, so on and so forth. But other than that, you don't give it any real power. You give the power to play among people that you can control at state and local government. Right? So if you were an American in 1781, you have one big happy family behind the idea the US government should be weak. It wasn't a consensus. That is, you had a small minority that thought this was a bad idea, largely ex military officers. We'll get more into that later. But you have a pretty good cross section of America that is very happy with the plan they came up with under the Articles. And within 6 years, the wealthy and powerful in America took the Articles, threw it in the garbage, and drew up a new plan, the Constitution that created a very powerful government. Right? Why they did that is because the Articles actually worked too well. It was designed to create a weak government. It did. It turns out, though, that you got to be careful because for what you wish for, because you might get it. They wanted a weak government, they got it. And during the 1780s, though, the United States dealt with a series of problems. And these problems threatened to destroy the country. And these problems led a handful of wealthy and powerful people to decide that they were wrong in delivering a national government that was weak. That is, they needed to create a powerful national government in order to deal with all those problems that were around in the 1780s. And these were the guys who are going to meet together and draw up the Constitution. So let's go through and look at what those problems were. That is, if we're dealing with this on an essay, once you got that the Articles created a weak government, you got to go into the problems of the 1780s and why this convinced the wealthy and powerful that this government was a bad idea after all, that they were wrong in the first place. And you see three big groups of problems that they were dealing with. The first big group of problems dealt with national security. Right? That is, the United States was created in 1781 in a dog eat dog world. That is, you saw a bunch of nations that were constantly competing against each other for resources, for land. And if you weren't one of the sharks in that world, you were one of the minnows. Okay? It was kill or be killed. So let's let that in mind. Let's look at the United States. The United States emerges from the Revolutionary War a huge nation. It is covering a lot of land. The bulk of the population, though, lived within about 50 miles of the Atlantic Ocean. So the United States had very weak control over pretty much most of the country. And there were a lot of people in the world who wanted this land. And the United States found that their weak government could not defend their borders. And let's give some examples of this. When the Revolutionary War ended, the British Army still had a lot of posts throughout the American West. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania was a British Army post. Detroit, Michigan was a British Army post. Chicago, Illinois was a British Army post. When the war ended, the British Army was supposed to abandon all those posts, take all their troops in, and head to Canada. 1781 came and went, and the British Army was still there. Right? They still occupied large segments of the American West where their soldiers were dealing with local Indians because you still had organized Native American nations out here. They were trading with them. They were making treaties with them. So if you're an American patriot, this is humiliating. You have a foreign military force in your country that is threatening to take away these parts of your country and is dealing with people to try to do it. So, if that's the case, what can you do about it? Well, you can send your army up into the West, attack those British forts, kick the British out, and maintain control of your country. The problem with that plan, remember, is that the United States government did not have the authority to create an army to go do this. So the United States asked the 13 states to give them troops to go in there and secure the West. The 13 states said no. So throughout the 1780s, this British presence in the West kept on growing. Right? And who knows when they would decide, it's time to take this away from ourselves. The United States saw a similar problem down here in the Southwest. The nation of Spain controlled Texas and Louisiana at that time. Spain also claimed what is present day Alabama and Mississippi and Georgia. Right? And during the 1780s, Spain tried to act on those claims. They did it by dealing with American settlers who went in this area. Particularly, they dealt with a man named Daniel Boone. You might be familiar with the name. He was a frontiersman. Whenever American history becomes big in popular culture, he becomes a national hero. In the 50s, Disney made a big TV show about him. Daniel Boone is most famous for going into what is present day Kentucky and founding the state. But what Disney never said on their TV shows was in the 1780s, Daniel Boone left Kentucky, crossed the Mississippi River into Spanish territory, met with the Spanish government, accepted Spanish citizenship, and took a steamer trunk full of money from them. He then said he would go back across the Mississippi River, organize all the settlers in Kentucky and the rest of the West, pull those areas out of the United States, and give them to Spain. Why would Daniel Boone do such a thing? Because the United States had almost no presence over here. They weren't sending any troops to protect anybody. They weren't building any infrastructure out here. These guys out here in Kentucky, Alabama, Mississippi were on their own, right? And so they looked for Spain for protection and for opportunities. What could the United States government do about that? Absolutely nothing. They didn't have any troops. They didn't have a military. They didn't have any money. So the United States went through the entire 1780s unable to secure its own borders, with powerful nations conspiring essentially to take away parts of America. If you were in the United States at the time, that would have been totally humiliating. After all, if any of you remember the 2016 elections, one of the big issues in the elections was illegal immigration, where the opponents of immigration saw these immigrants crossing the border as a threat to the future of the United States, as a humiliation to the country. These were guys who were crossing the border in 2016 to come in and work. Imagine what it would have been like if armed soldiers crossed the border, set up forts, and were conspiring with local people to tear away parts of the country. Okay? This would be humiliating. It would be a threat to the future. And that was the state of America in 1781, 1782, 1783. And those border problems were not the only national security issue they had. Another national security issue they had involved piracy. As the oceans of the world in the 1780s were full of pirates. They were not cool pirates like Johnny Depp. They were mean pirates who would steal ships and kill people. The world's center of piracy was North Africa. Right? That is, where these pirates initially came from were the navies of the big nations like Spain, France, and England. Life in a navy was hard and brutal. Discipline was bad, and pay was terrible. It's basically like being in that aircraft carrier with the coronavirus. So what a lot of times the crews of those Navy ships did was they just mutinied. They killed their captain, took over the ship, and took the ship and went robbing and stealing. If you were such a pirate, you could go to what is present day North Africa. Right? They were ports on the coast of North Africa, like Algiers, Tunis, Casablanca. Tripoli. If you sailed into one of those ports, the ports were ruled by a local king, and the local king would cut you a deal. If you gave him half of what you stole, he would allow you to sell your stolen goods in his port, right? And he would let you operate out of his port. That is, you could use the port as a base, right? After you sold your cargo, you could then buy supplies in that port. Right? At the time, this place was called the Barbary Coast. So these pirates were called the Barbary Corsairs, or the Barbary Pirates. And they were a menace to shipping all over the world. How nations dealt with this menace was they built navies to go after the pirates, but also they dealt with it by spreading money around. That is, the kings that ruled these ports would run protection rackets. So they would go to big nations like Spain, Portugal, France, England, and basically shake them down. They would say, if you pay us a bribe at the beginning of every year, we will tell our pirates not to bother your ships. This process was called paying tribute, right? So if you were an American shipper in 1770, the British government paid tribute to the pirates to leave your ships alone. And if a pirate double crossed Britain, then Britain would send the Royal Navy out after them to take out the pirate. It is now 1781 and the United States is independent. Britain tells American ships, screw you, you're on your own. Right? So American shippers start dealing with pirates. So the shippers go to Congress and they ask Congress to pay protection money to the African kings so the pirates won't bother their ships. The problem with that plan is that under the Articles, the United States government had no authority to tax anybody and come up with any money. So they didn't have any money to pay off pirates or do anything else. So the shippers said, okay, if you can't pay off the pirates, send the US Navy out after the pirates and protect our ships. The problem with that plan was that under the Articles, the United States did not have the authority to create a military. So they didn't have a navy to go after pirates or do anything else. So what could the shippers do about the pirates? Absolutely nothing. So if you owned a ship in 1782 and you were flying an American flag from it, you might as well paint a bullseye on it. Every pirate in the ocean is going to come straight after you. There was so much piracy of American ships during the 1780s that you actually had a reverse slave trade going on. Pirates would take American sailors captive and sell them into slavery in North Africa. So, if you are in the United States, this is humiliating. Your country looks weak. And one of the major sources of your economy, shipping, is being threatened because the shippers are now afraid to go out into the ocean. Right? This is a big national security issue. The United States can't deal with it under the Articles. They also had another related national security issue, and that's one that we've already dealt with when we talked about the American Revolution, and that is something called impressment. Remember, life on those Navy ships was hard and brutal. So what the navies of the world would do is that they would kidnap civilian sailors at sea and basically force them into their navies. That was the policy of impressment. Now that the United States is independent, the British Navy is going to be even more aggressive in doing that against American ships. So is the navies of other big European nations like France. What can the United States do about that? Absolutely nothing. So if you are a leader or citizen of the United States, if you're a patriot in the 1780s, your country has major national security issues, and you're afraid of the future. But your country has bigger problems than that. And those bigger problems are laid out by the great historian John Shaft, who once said, even when it's not about the money, it's about the money. And they say that Shaft was a bad mother. This is true. What does money have to do with this? Well, the United States had just fought a war to get its independence. During that war, the United States and the various states in it had to borrow a lot of money. Wars are expensive, right? So, in order to pay for this war, the United States started printing paper money. That is, at that time, the world was under the gold standard. You were supposed to take your gold or your silver, make coins out of them, pay for what you needed. The government did not have enough gold in order to pay for the Revolutionary War. So what they did instead was they started to print pieces of paper and hand them out as IOUs. Technically, if you had a piece of paper like this, a $30 bill, you were supposed to be able to take this $30 bill down to the treasury and they would give you $30 worth in gold or silver. However, they had no gold or silver, so all you got was the piece of paper, the IOU. And as the war got more expensive, the government just printed more IOUs. So what you get by the end of the Revolutionary War is a huge wave of inflation. Right? So prices of everything in America are going up. So if you were an American in the 1780s, you're dealing with the aftermath of this wave of inflation. But the bigger problem was just the debt itself, okay? Because the government and the states owed huge amounts of money. So if you're the national government, you now have to pay off this debt. Right? Who do you owe money to? Well, you owe money to a lot of foreign nations. Okay, nations like France and the Netherlands loaned you money in order to fight the Revolutionary War, but also you owe a lot of money internally. That is, the government paid for the Revolutionary War by giving IOUs to farmers to get food in order to feed the soldiers. They gave IOUs to merchants in order to buy supplies for the soldiers. They gave IOUs to the soldiers as their pay. So now that the war is over, all those IOUs have to be paid. The problem with that is, remember, under the Articles of Confederation, the U.S. government couldn't tax anybody. So it didn't have any money to pay off IOUs or anything else. So the U.S. government asked the states for money so they could pay back their debts. The states said no. So what that means is during the 1780s, the U.S. government defaulted on its debts. That is, it started stiffing everybody. If the U.S. government owed you money, you were not getting paid back. One of the long-term consequences about that, by the way, is it bankrupted the French government. The French loaned the U.S. government a lot of money for the Revolutionary War. The Americans never paid them back. The French government had so much economic problems because of this that they had an economic collapse in 1789. And the next thing, the king that loaned America the money knew, he got his head chopped off. But in America, actually, the problems are worse, right? Because all over America, you had merchants, you had farmers, you had citizens who now were not getting paid back the money they owed. The problem with that is that they owed money too, right? Because look at it from the perspective of, say, you're a small farmer. If you were somebody who left your farm to go fight in the Revolutionary armies, you would have to borrow money to keep your farm going while you were gone, to hire laborers. Right? If you were a merchant, you bought your inventory that you sold to the government, okay, probably through borrowed money. When the government stiffs you, you stiff all the people you owe money to. The next thing you know, there is a financial crisis in America. If any of you remember back to 2008, you saw something similar happen. That financial crisis was driven by the collapse of real estate prices. That is, speculators borrowed money to buy real estate. When the price of the real estate went down, they didn't pay back the money. So the banks that loaned them the money went broke. And when the banks went broke, you wound up with a depression in America. The depression would have been worse, except the government went in and bailed out the banks. In 1781, though, the American government was the problem. They were the ones who were stiffing all their creditors. So when the banks aren't getting paid back, there is nobody to bail them out. The next thing you know, you have a deep depression throughout the United States. Right? That is, as the financial system collapses, you have businesses that can't stay open. In the towns, there is no demand for laborers. Right? Prices for crops decline because nobody has money to buy them. Right? And not only can't the U.S. government do anything about this financial crisis, the U.S. government is the root cause of the financial crisis. Right? So you have economic problems that are driven by government debt. You also have economic problems that were driven by the victory in the revolution. Because when we went over the build up to the Revolutionary War, remember there were three ways you could get rich in America. You could be a slave owner in the South who would grow a crop that would be sold for money, like tobacco. You could be a merchant in New England that would carry cargoes around the world. You could be a food producer who would grow food and sell it to the slave colonies in the Caribbean. Remember who each one of those main customer was. If you were a slave owning farmer, you sold your crop to England before the revolution. Under the mercantilist system, you had privileged access to their markets. If you were an American shipper, you carried English cargoes. Under the English mercantilist laws, merchants had to ship their goods on ships from the empire. So American ships carried 2/3 of all of Britain's cargoes in 1770. If you were a food producer, you sold your food to the British colonies in the Caribbean, especially Jamaica. Now that America is independent, the British say to the Americans, screw you, you're on your own. Because now under mercantilism, America is just another foreign nation. They don't want their money leaving the British Empire to go to America. So now all those British mercantilist regulations apply to them. Right? American tobacco farmers find that they can't sell tobacco in England anymore. American merchants find that American shippers find that the English merchants aren't allowed to use their ships anymore. American food producers find that they don't have access to Jamaica anymore. Jamaica, by the way, by itself was the second largest consumer of American products in before the Revolution. Right? The number one consumer of American products was the English home islands. So, what can the United States do about this? Also, the Americans, by the way, have another problem. Under mercantilism, the British want to export. So the British government starts subsidizing their producers to sell stuff in America. So say if you're an American hammer maker in Philadelphia, right, your hammers are competing against British hammers that are getting a subsidy from the government so they can be sold cheaper. So an American is finding he can't sell anything in England, and English stuff is being subsidized to compete against him here. You would find the same thing from France, the same thing from Spain, the same thing from every other powerful European nation that is mercantilist. So, what can the United States do about it? Well, that's actually been an issue for the past 4 years. President Trump has complained a lot about competition with stuff from China. That is, he claims that the competition is unfair. The Chinese have trade regulations which keep American goods out, and they subsidize Chinese stuff which is sold here. How he tried to deal with that was through tariffs. That is, he put taxes on Chinese stuff when it comes into America. So if you are the Congress in the 1780s under the Articles of Confederation, you could tax English, French, Spanish stuff to force the English, French, or Spanish to change their laws and treat America fairly. What's the problem with that plan? The Articles of Confederation says the U.S. government can't tax anybody. So tariffs can't be done. But there's an indirect way to do the same thing, and that's by passing trade regulations. Right? That is, you could just pass a law that says stuff from England is illegal to be sold to the United States unless England allows American goods to be sold in England. Right? That is not a tax. That is a regulation. So you can get Congress to pass those kind of trade regulations to give you leverage. What's the problem with that plan? Under the Articles of Confederation, the U.S. Congress was not given the authority to regulate trade. So what could the United States do To gain access to European markets, absolutely nothing. You put all that together, you've got tremendous pressure on the American economy. Right? Between 1781 and 1787, the gross national product of the United States, that's the value of all goods and services produced in the country, declined by 25%. That's the worst economic performance in the entire history of the United States, matched only by the Great Depression between 1929 and 1933, and possibly matched by today. That is, we'll see what the coronavirus does to people. They're actually projecting something fairly similar in the next couple of years. So, if you are the public of the United States, if you're the leadership of the United States, you've got tremendous problems. You've got national security issues. You've got economic issues that the government can't deal with and that the government is actually contributing to. And by the way, when you see a tremendous economic pressure like that, one of the things you usually wind up seeing is the expansion of government power. Right? For example, when you look at the Depression led to a huge expansion of the power of the United States. Between the total federal government spending in 1929 was 2% of the gross national product of the United States. By 1940, it was 10%. Right? The economic crisis of the 1780s led to a huge expansion of American government power into the new Constitution. We'll get more into that in a minute. And look at what's going on right now. That is, as the coronavirus crisis is going on, you're seeing this tremendous economic crisis that's being generated by it. I've seen numbers that 1/3 of the country is out of work now. And look at how powerful the government has become as a result. The Congress just passed what was it, a $2 trillion stimulus package a couple of weeks ago. They have they're sending $1,200 a person to people. They are uh, putting in a bailout package for small business. They're putting in a $500 billion bailout package to big business, which, by the way, gives the Federal Reserve the authority to give $2 trillion more to big business. So economic pressures like this are big centralizing forces. They're something that lead to the government becoming more powerful. But we still haven't gotten to the big problem the United States had in the 1780s yet. The big problem was by the time you get to 1787, powerful people in America were afraid that the very fabric of law and order was going to fall apart. That is, all these crises were making America so desperate that Americans would take justice into their own hands and the entire structure of society would collapse. This is something conspiracy nuts like to go over a lot. But in the 1780s, you could see why they would be concerned about that. Right? For example, look at the southern states. In the southern states, the position of a rich person was based off of slavery. Nobody ever volunteered to be a slave in the history of the world. Right? The only way you keep somebody enslaved is by force. Right? Before the Revolutionary War, you do this by violence and the implied threat of violence. If the slaves are afraid, they won't challenge you as a master. But remember, during the Revolutionary War, both sides competed for slaves to support the war effort. Both sides wanted African American soldiers, right? And the chaos of the war gave a lot of slaves the opportunity to get away. For example, during the Revolutionary War, 1/3 of all the slaves in Georgia escaped. 25,000 slaves in South Carolina escaped. And where they wound up going were the towns of America. That's so you start to see within towns free black populations that arose during the Revolutionary War. Also, large numbers of them, particularly in Georgia, made their way into Florida. Florida at that time was a Spanish colony. The Spanish had a very weak presence there. The most powerful force in Florida was the Seminole Nation of Native Americans. The Seminoles allowed African Americans to become members of the nation. Now, if you were an escaped slave, they would accept you into the people. Seminoles and African Americans intermarried, and they were basically a magnet for black people who wanted out of slavery. That ultimately it's actually going to lead to a war between the United States and the Seminoles. The United States is going to try to drive the Seminoles out of Florida. And one of the sticking issues there is they also wanted to re-enslave all the black people who were part of the Seminole Nation. Seminoles fought back. They lost Florida, but they kept the black people. So when they moved into Oklahoma, you have a basically an racially integrated group going to Oklahoma. But anyway, so if you're a slave owner, you are terrified of the collapse of law and order. And even if you're not a slave owner, if people get desperate enough, maybe they will turn on you. Because remember, if you're a property owner in general, the very existence of property depends on law and order. Right? Because if law and order doesn't exist, then property only comes from the barrel of a gun. If you can't defend your property, then somebody else could take it from you. Right? And if you're a rich guy, you're always a minority. There are always more people out there that don't have property than you have. Right? So if they get a head of steam under them, you're in a lot of trouble. And if you lived in America in the 1780s, you could kind of feel the entire social fabric of the country falling apart. We talked about this if you were a slave owner. That is, you would see a lot of people got out of slavery, and even those slaves that remained were not nearly as afraid of the masters as they used to be. That is, you read the diaries of slave owners, they are talking about this. They're afraid of slave revolt. And you could see in other places similar problems. For example, what you're looking at in front of you is a letter from George Washington. And let me give you the background of this. In the late 1780s, the army that was fighting the British in the Revolution was camped at Newburgh, New York. The army was traditionally not paid very well. And remember, the Continental Congress was corrupt and ineffective, so even the money they were supposed to get, they didn't get. When they got paid in IOUs that were worthless. No merchant would take them. Right? And the soldiers were angry. And as you get in the early 1780s, their officers are angry too, because the officers were promised pensions for their service during the Revolutionary War. And they didn't think Congress was going to make good on them. So in the early 1780s, the army at Newburgh decided to do something about it. Right? It's called the Newburgh Conspiracy. It's one of the terms I put on your list. What the Newburgh Conspiracy was a bunch of Revolutionary War officers conspired basically to take their troops, march on Philadelphia, where the rebel capital was, and point their guns at Congress and tell the Congress to fund their pensions. And if they would have actually done this, the entire future of the United States would have been different because they would have demonstrated that the military could get involved in political affairs and civilian affairs. And once the military gets involved in the civilian world, the military doesn't leave. Right? The only thing that really stopped them was George Washington. George Washington, the commander of the army, was somebody who really believed that the civilians should run the country. He wanted the army to stay out of civilian affairs. So when he found out about the conspiracy, he called all the officers together into a big meeting. And when he called them into a meeting, he read them a speech. This is the speech. He pulled it out of his pocket. So he started reading it. He got a little bit of the way through, and then he stopped. The officers to this point were pretty surly. That is, they were pissed off. They didn't want to listen to Washington. But when he stopped, he pulled out of his coat pocket his glasses, and he put them on to keep on reading. He apologized to the officer, said, "Sorry, all, I've sacrificed so much for my country that my eyesight is going too." The officers cried, and George knew how to lay it on thick. So the only reason the United States government wasn't overthrown in 1783 was because George Washington talked the army out of it. Right? Think about that. If you are living in the United States, you're living on a knife's edge. There are a lot of people who are desperate. Right? Congress could deal with the army by just disbanding it, but the desperation is still there among the civilians. And all they need is to get angry enough or desperate enough, and they will act. Right? And the moment of truth came in 1776, right, in Massachusetts, in something called Shays' Rebellion. The Shays in Shays' Rebellion was this man over here. His name is Daniel Shays. Daniel Shays was a small farmer from western Massachusetts. And during the Revolutionary War, he was a captain of the local militia. His militia unit fought with Washington's army, so they were gone a lot. So he and his unit borrowed a lot of money to keep their farms going while they were gone. They, however, were never paid the money that they were promised by the U.S. government. So increasingly, they found they couldn't pay back their debts. This was further harmed by the economic crisis that were going on. If they had to sell crops in order to raise money, the prices for those crops were low. So what you wound up with in western Massachusetts was just a wave of foreclosure auctions. As farmers couldn't pay back their debts, they lost their land. In 1786, though, Shays had had enough. So he got his old militia unit together. They went basically all Ocean's 11. Once they got together, they got their guns and marched on the courthouse. They went in, talked to the judge, and told the judge there would be no more foreclosure auctions today. The judge took one look at the guns and said, "Okay," and went home. They then went into town and looked for the people they owed money to. They then beat the hell out of them. Also, they tarred and feathered them. If you're unfamiliar with the tarring and feathering, that's where you take somebody, you strip him naked, you dip hot tar on him, and you stick feather on him so he looks like a big goofy bird. A big goofy bird with third-degree burns over parts of his body. This, by the way, was the last tar and feathering known in the United States. It was done during World War I. This guy, I think his name was John Mines, was tarred and feathered by a mob for the crime of speaking German in public. Anyway, say you are one of the rich guys in western Massachusetts. You see an angry mob rampaging through your town, destroying your property and taking all your rich friends and tarring and feathering them. This is a crisis of law and order. So what can you do about it? Well, you go to local government. You go to the local police and tell the local police to stop the mob. The local police goes out to the mob, takes one look, and runs away like this. Ah! So the local government cannot defend you. Your next step on the chain is the state government. You tell the state government to call out the militia to put down the mob. The problem with that plan is this is the state militia. They are the mob. So what the rich guys say is they want the Massachusetts legislature to call out the militia from someplace else in Massachusetts. Send in a militia from eastern Massachusetts to put down this mob. The legislature said no. Why'd they say no? Because the same conditions were everywhere in Massachusetts. They were afraid that if they sent in a militia from someplace else, they were just as likely to join the mob and spread the revolt throughout the state than they were to put down the mob. So the rich guys went to the local government couldn't handle the crisis. They went to the state government, Shays' Rebellion. The state couldn't handle the crisis. So the next step is to go to the national government. And what can the national government do? Under the Articles of Confederation, absolutely nothing. Which means if you're a rich guy in western Massachusetts, you are totally screwed. They dealt with the immediate crisis by borrowing a militia from Connecticut to put down Shays' Rebellion. Shays was then arrested, and he was sent into exile in Vermont, which actually isn't a bad end for Shays because Vermont is a very nice place, right? Full of green mountains, hills, and cows. Right? Actually, when I retire, I'm thinking of moving there. Go to Vermont and start up my own St. Bernard ranch. Get me a house, some acreage, maybe 20, 30 head of St. Bernard. It'll be the happiest place on earth. Right? Anyway, rich people throughout America were terrified by Shays' Rebellion because they knew the same thing could happen anywhere else. If you're a big food producer with tenants in New York State, your tenants could rise up against you. If you're a merchant in Philadelphia, an angry mob of laborers could rise up, loot your stores. If you're a slave owner in South Carolina, the slaves could rise up, gain their freedom, kill you in the process. The rich people throughout America were concluded from Shays' Rebellion that they were wrong in 1781, that having a weak national government was a bad idea, that they needed a powerful national government as an insurance policy in case something like Shays' Rebellion could happen to them. And while it was at it, this now a more powerful national government could also deal with the underlying problems, could deal with the bad economy, could protect the country from foreign threats. So, with that in mind, 55 wealthy and powerful people decided to meet informally in Philadelphia. Their goal was to draw up a set of amendments for the Articles of Confederation that would make the U.S. government more effective. Right? They had no formal authority to meet. That is, no state asked them to get together. The Congress under the Articles didn't ask them to get together and offer them any ideas. They were just 55 rich guys. They were important in the country, so they just decided to meet anyway. This group was taken very seriously because George Washington himself agreed to go. The man who talked them into it was a guy named Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton was the leader of the financial community in America. He was considered the friend of the bankers. And he was also very close to Washington. He was somebody who served under Washington during the Revolutionary War. Hamilton, throughout the 1780s, wanted a more powerful government. He and a lot of other revolutionary officers did. Now the crisis in the country was big enough that they figured they could actually get it. Now that Washington and 55 prominent people are meeting, the Congress decided to get ahead of the game. So they passed a proclamation that asked this meeting to give them proposals to amend the articles. They, however, did not give them any authority to do anything else. Right? So these 55 guys met in Philadelphia. The first thing they decided once they met was that the articles were unamendable. That is, when John Dickinson created a weak national government in the articles, he did a good job. There was no way to alter this framework in order to give the government any more power. So they decided rather than alter the articles, they were just going to throw it away and start over from scratch. They had no legal authority to do this. That is, the Congress did not tell them to come up with a new plan of government, just said you can come up with some amendments to the articles if you want. So technically, the entire meeting from this point was illegal. Okay? You could call it sedition against the United States government. And once they decided to draw up a new plan of government, right, they decided that this new plan of government would be drawn up in secret. Right? That is, they figured they couldn't make any decisions if the press was watching. So they said the meeting would be sealed, no reporters would be allowed in, and they would not keep a transcript of their deliberations. Right? They even went to extremes in order to make sure that nobody knew what was going on. They were meeting in Philadelphia in the summertime. Philadelphia's weather in the summertime is like Houston, only not quite as hot. Right? That is, it is hot, sticky, and humid. They were meeting in a small building, Constitution Hall. They did not have air conditioning yet. They shut the windows to Constitution Hall because they didn't want the public or any reporters listening in at an open window hearing what was going on inside. Even today, the only reason we know anything about what was going on at the articles was because one of the principal writers of the Constitution, a guy named James Madison, kept notes. And what he came up with is the modern U.S. Constitution. And the modern U.S. Constitution is a plan for a very powerful government.